All right, we've just got about 4 more minutes, and I just was looking. I do not see Caledonia or Bethany. Let me see. Okay.
Fran, I'm adding a slurl to this accessibility sign. If you don't mind sharing that with me. I think Val did earlier. I can probably use that one, but whichever one you guys want me to use. Okay, I'll find it. Oh, I found it. It's fine. Thank you. Thank you. Perfect.
Welcome, little rover. I have sent an IM to Caledonia since we're running right to the top of the hour, and she's welcome to just come on whenever she gets here, and I'll juggle my slides around. If something's happened that Bethany's not here on time, she's a little bit later in the presentation, we will just go for it, and I'll see what we can do with her slides. They're great, so we'll just handle that and see what happens.
Yeah, it'll be fine. It happened before with the last panel.
Yeah, it happens. We just go with it. Oh, yay. I see Caledonia has arrived, so this is wonderful. And hopefully Callie can hear me, and will be sitting right to the left of me between me and Marie. So we'll let her get settled in, and we still have 2 full minutes to spare. And Caledonia, if you'll walk right on up, you can sit right between me and Marie. See this underneath our slides. So come on up. We're just about ready to begin. And Fran, are you all set for live stream? Perfect. All right, then let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to the Virtual Worlds Education Consortium Metaverse Expert Series. We're glad to have you join us for today's very interesting presentation and discussion. Today we take a look at a high-quality historical simulation which has been held annually in Second Life since 2012, the Dickens Project. And we have a panel of experts who share diverse research contributions. For those of you who are new to the Virtual Worlds Education Consortium, our website is here in local chat, www.vweconsortium.org. You can also find VWEC on many social media channels. Here's our link tree, VWE Consortium. After our presentation today, we will move to the deck for a more informal conversation and social time for those who are able to stay. We're pleased to offer our expert series presentations in both text and chat. Text for anyone who may not be using voice is shared on our YouTube live stream, and here's the link in local chat. You can also find that link in the sign at the front of our stage to the right. Speaking of signs, we'd like to know how you found out about our events. Our survey plant has a quick survey that's a great help to us. If you would fill it out, and feel free to send along any comments that you have. It's also right there to the right of the stage. I am pleased to introduce our Metaverse expert speakers to you today. We will be hearing from Caledonia Skytower of Seanchai Library, leader of the Dickens Project, Marie Vans, Associate Professor of Systems Engineering at Colorado State University, Bethany Winslow, Director of Online Learning at San Jose State University, Shannon Broden, San Jose State University student, soon to graduate with her degree in a Master's of Library and Information Science, Esperanza Fries, retired educator and educational consultant, and Gentle Heron, the leader of Virtual Ability Island here in Second Life. The Dickens Project began, as I said, back in 2012, and the Community Virtual Library has always played a role since the beginning to providing opportunities to research many of the aspects of the Victorian era and the life of Charles Dickens. Our panelists will share perspectives on the value of bringing both history and literature to life through immersive learning experiences. You will hear about how research is added yearly and how students can be actively engaged. While we strive for historical accuracy with the examples that these panelists will share, we believe students can learn through teachable moments where we examine all these elements of the historical time, such as the clothing, the architecture, furnishings, toys, food of the culture, and more. Now, we're not the costume cops, but we find conversations arise and interest in history is sparked. We have conversations about what they wore. Wait, they did not wear sneakers. It's a great time for students to dig into that and think about what actually is accurate and authentic. This year, there's a new personal HUD that enhances the experience, which you can read about right here at the website, irelandstory.blogspot.com. Our first guest speaker is the leader, as I mentioned, at the Seanchai Library. And there's the blog post for Seanchai Library. Seanchai means storyteller in Irish. This library brings stories to life in the metaverse. And we have the leader of Seanchai Library with us today. So Caledonia, can you share a bit about the Dickens Project? Anything you care to share about how it's developed and grown over these past 12 years?
You bet. Val, thanks for inviting me to be part of the panel today. It's really an honor to share this time with you. And gosh, the first Dickens project in 2012 was on 900 meters on a community virtual library region. Who knew that it would grow to be? It's actually a 3-region estate now. 2 regions are Dickens, and one region is Bradbury, which just became a full region project this year. Now, we often get lumped under historical simulations, but the Dickens Project is not a historical simulation. Certainly, that's not its primary intent. The Dickens Project, along with the other special project builds that we've produced over the last 16 years, the Bradbury Project, Evil Under the Sun, Murder at the Vicarage, Death on the Nile, Murder, you might think we do an awful lot of Agatha Christie. Murder on the Orient Express, The Great Gatsby of Mice and Men, and Hound of the Baskervilles have all had a primary objective that was emphatically not to recreate historical experiences for guests. What we do is create virtual experiences inspired by works of literature to encourage people to engage with literature and, in some cases, to enable them. All of these works have referenced general or specific historical time periods, it's true, but our number one inspiration come from the words of the author. That's our jumping off point. Historical accuracy plays into what we do in the same way that such references are used in the theater and film industries. We are telling a story, so we look for historical plausibility, not accuracy. Well, what do I mean? We want to give our guests the spirit of the literature flavored by the historical time period it was written for or written in. We want to provide them with opportunities to learn more about the period and the author, but we don't focus rigidly on documentary historical accuracy. I mean, have you seen Marketplace? Unless you have an original mesh creator in your pocket, it's almost impossible to find all the parts and pieces that you need for such a thing. And as an example, I also think, another example, I think it's also important to ask why historical? To what end are you creating this environment? For this year's first full region Bradbury project, as an example, we focused on one work of fiction out of his entire canon, but we honored a very specific subset of Ray Bradbury's work, the Greentown stories. Now, those stories come from 4 different publications and are set in a variety of times from the early 1920s to the late 1970s. So, we chose the 1950s as our target to support the sort of nostalgia that is laced through this particular part of Bradbury's work. That was our why. I don't I don't want you to think that we play fast and loose with period details and that historical accuracy doesn't play a part in what we do. It does, but it's not the primary driving factor. It's not what drives the bus. Our goal is to inspire people to seek out works of literature and to engage with them. And but it's certainly not to have an encyclopedic command of the skirt forms of the Victorian age. And again, I would urge anyone who takes on the task of doing a historical build to have a why that is broader than just a year or a span of years. Perhaps focus on a specific event that had a broader global impact, or a technical innovation, or an environmental event like the Great Eruption of Vesuvius in 79 AD, or a great one would be the eruption of Krakatoa in 1883, which had a global impact on the weather and environment for the next decade. But that's just my 2 cents worth. Now, when Val asked me to share time with you all today, she also asked me to address how Seanchai Library funds these projects. And to be honest, we don't, at least not in monetary terms. We don't have an institution or a nonprofit behind us. We have had 2 projects out of all the ones that I mentioned earlier that have received monetary granted support. In both cases, we partnered with a nonprofit outside of Second Life. And both projects were actually produced in Kitely and not in Second Life because we couldn't have afforded to build them in Second Life at that time. So from a material expenses point of view, things like the Dickens Project and the Bradbury Project are currently paid for out of the pockets of the people who participate on the build team. We do it because we love it and because we often use the materials we gather in other projects or as part of our own personal passions. However, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the support that we do get. Initially, when we moved out of, oh gosh, when we, it was the Second Life Endowment for the Arts, or was it the Linden Lab Endowment for the, I don't remember what they were. The LEA, where we were for 2 or 3 years, and then when we started getting direct support from the lab. It's been, I think, about 5 years since I first went to the lab and I asked for their support in terms of the virtual regions. It started out with 1 and 2, and now we have 3, and I don't know that we're going to go more than that. I was surprised the year that I asked for the regions to get upgraded to 30K, and they were like, hey, sure. Inarguably, the virtual regions would be the largest expense on a project like this, what it might have outside of personnel costs if we were paying people. And because it's not like you put these things up overnight, you know, they take time to create. Part of our pitch to the lab was not, I think if we had pitched any one thing to the lab, they probably wouldn't have given us the support, and they probably wouldn't have been as continually supportive and generous with us as they have been. The reality is, it costs the lab very little to click on a couple regions for us. Really doesn't. But they like what we do, and they like what we do not because we provide educational content, not because we create cultural content, not because we provide opportunities for virtual artists across a number of different creative expressive forms, not because we build community by doing what we do, but because we do all four. That's what got us and continues to get us the support of Linden Lab. And I think that might be my 8 minutes, Val. So
Wonderful.
thanks for letting me share with you today.
Oh, absolutely. We're just honored and thrilled that you're here. And you sent me a shot of the new HUD. So just so people can see, there's some information here about a HUD where you can actually hear the story of A Christmas Carol as you're wandering through the project. And it makes it very interactive when you're going and looking around the beautiful snowy landscape of London at that time. And I like that Caledonia is explaining that the goal is not to be totally historically accurate, but we're going to share these examples today of immersive learning, and also the fact that any literary or historical simulation does require research. Even if it's just skimming the surface of the research, some of these researchers have really dug deep. So thank you for sharing that. And next, we have a panelist, Marie Vans, who's going to share her research project on the debtors' prisons during the Dickens era in London. Now, this research gives a glimpse into just how hard the times actually were during the Victorian era. So, Marie, would you go ahead and share your research?
Sure. There we go. Okay. Well, thanks so much for letting me participate in this event. And I have to say that the Dickens Project is one of my favorite events of the year in Second Life. And it's not only because Dickens is one of my favorite writers, but because the Victorian era is one of the most fascinating periods in recent history, especially if you look at it through the lens of science and innovation. That actually does include prisons. In 2016, when I participated in my first Dickens research project, I picked Debtors' Prison simply because Dickens' semi-autobiographical novel David Copperfield covered a period of time when his own father went to Debtors' Prison. It was interesting to me that that whole families could actually live together in this prison, unlike today, obviously. So also, I recently found out that the treadmill, which is something that I use all the time at the gym, was an invention created during the Victorian era as a punishment for prisoners. And that makes perfect sense to me. So if you were to go to the CVL Dickens warehouse, you will find the Debtors' Prison in Victorian England presentation that covers all of these topics that I have here. But I do point out that Debtors' Prison still exists, but in a different form here in the U.S., which makes the aphorism "people who don't study history are doomed to repeat it" pretty much spot on. And so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put the slurl for the what do you call it, up in there. Did it work? Okay, it's missing. So if you go to the warehouse, the CVL warehouse, the prison, the whole presentation is there. We don't have time to go through it today. Okay, so next slide. Speaking of science and innovation, the very first World's Fair was a Victorian invention. As I dug deeper and deeper into this topic, the information was mind-blowing. As a result, I actually created 3 separate presentations, which are available on the ground floor of the Vicara house that's near the CVL warehouse on Dickens Project. The first presentation covers the history of how Henry Cole convinced Prince Albert, who was Victoria's husband and prince consort, to put on the Great Exhibition of 1851. I cover how the Crystal Palace, where the exhibition occurred, was constructed in Hyde Park in London, including the idea that it should look like a giant Victorian greenhouse. The second presentation covers the people, so next slide, involved in the exhibition. And that includes Charles Dickens himself, who wrote about it and showed himself to be somewhat of a racist against foreign exhibits. The final presentation, next slide, covers the exhibits and inventions. Just the guide contained more than 100 pages. 30 countries were represented, and there were approximately there was approximately didn't get on there. There's approximately 6 million people that attended between May and October. So the whole topic of the Great Exhibition of 1851 was a rabbit hole for me, and I am so grateful for the opportunity that the Dickens Project gave me as an excuse to jump down it. And here's the URL, the slurl for the Vicara exhibit in the chat, and that's it for me. Thanks.
Thank you, Marie. So exciting that the Industrial Revolution was just bursting at the Great Exhibition of 1851. Now, our next panelist is Bethany Winslow, and she will share a more lighthearted, fun research project, completely different than the horrors of the debtors' prisons. And this is an example of the variety of these different kinds of historical research projects that students can dig into in a simulation like the Dickens Project. Now, one need not dress in Victorian attire to visit the Dickens Project, but it certainly does make it fun. Over to you, Bethany.
Great, thank you. Hopefully I don't sound like a chipmunk. Hi, everyone. I'm really delighted to give you guys a peek underneath the skirts of the fabulous world of Victorian ladies' clothing during the era of Dickens. I loved creating this presentation. It was a while back, and it was really fun to dive into the layers of laces, buttons, ribbons, and intricate details that defined their fashion, as well as the stark contrast between high society and the working class. Each element of this presentation, just stay on that first slide, I think, Val, I appreciate it. Each element could be a fascinating presentation just on its very own. And by the way, I do have the full slides of this presentation and the references at the iSchools region in our Victorian Village area. And I do first want to mention, and I'll let you know when to forward the slides, Val, thank you. I want to mention that Victorian clothing is characterized, first of all, by an abundance of layers. And it's, it's characterized by an abundance of layers in London's chilly winters. These layers provided warmth, and the fashion of the time wasn't just about aesthetics. It served practical purposes as well. Laces were, essential for securing undergarments, and decorative laces added beauty. Buttons played a significant role, and the button hook was a handy tool for fastening things. Ribbons and bows were not just practical, but they were beautiful adornments. And interestingly, Victorian fashion was ornate by modern standards. And while many in Dickens London lived in impoverished conditions, the impact of fashion was really pervasive. The middle class could afford to have high fashion replicated by local dressmakers or create their own clothes. And in contrast, the poor heavily relied on the secondhand clothes trade, which I didn't even know existed. They could re-dye, repurpose good fabrics into children's attire and whatnot, or patch worn things. So, clothes went through several different iterations, but let's next talk about specifics with the next slide. Thank you. So first of all, we do have to talk about undergarments, and essential pieces for undergarments, of course, were things that included chemise, stockings that reached the knee or higher, and drawers, often made of cotton, but sometimes wool or silk. Wealthier women, of course, had things adorned with ribbon and embroidery, adding elegance to even undergarments that were never seen, but always hidden. And an iconic garment, of course, is the corset. That deserves special mention. The split bust style with a slot and a stud closure made self-lacing easier, and it became very popular in the mid-century. However, lower class women often didn't wear corsets, especially if they engaged in hard labor. And the petticoats were another undergarment staple made from cotton, flannen, or muslin. Women wore often several layers for warmth and fullness. These things could be gathered or smoothed on the sides with more fullness in the back. There could be starching or cording to stiffen them, helping to support the desired bell shape of dresses. And of course, there's moving on to crinolines and hoop skirts. By the mid-century, these garments replaced some of the layers of petticoats. Crinolines made from horsehair and starch often incorporated steel elements for added structure. Typically, women wore at least 2 petticoats underneath a crinoline, one for comfort and warm and another for softening the structural elements. And a crinoline combined the features of or a crinolet, I should say, a crinolet combined the features of a crinoline and a bustle, providing the fullness at the back without needing a separate bustle. So next slide, please, Val. Now, outerwear. Let's discuss the camisole or corset cover was typically worn beneath a skirt, so you had additional clothing items. The dresses featured long sleeves. High necklines with low necklines are for evening wear. And in the early 1830s, a gigot is a leg of mutton sleeves, was characterized by the very voluminous shapes that popular at that time, but they quickly faded. By mid-century, the shoulder silhouette became narrower and the fullness shifted closer to the elbow. Skirts were gathered or pleated to enhance their fullness. And a detachable dust ruffle known as a balayage protected the hem of a dress from dirt and could easily be removed for washing. And interestingly, the term balayage also means street sweeper. In French, it reflects the sweeping nature of the fabric. And as we reach the final layers of dressing, wealthier women of the 1870s often wore an overshirt that was shorter, or an overskirt that was shorter in the front to reveal the elaborate details of the skirt underneath. And of course, a bodice was a fitted jacket made of matching material. This is kind of a lot going on here. Next slide, please, Val. So some finishing touches and accessories. First of all, shoes, not really a finishing touch, but the shoes are an important detail. They could be laced or buttoned up flat, or boots with, were commonly worn. And the hobnails reinforced the soles to add durability for daily wear. But final embellishments also depended upon the time of day, the weather, the occasion. Ladies might add detachable collars, capes, shawls, gloves, or jewelry to complete their outfits. And accessories like parasols, reticules, which are those small drawstring pouches, these things were also common. And now you might be wondering, how long did it actually take for a woman to get dressed? Did she need help, or could it be done on her own? And while it can be very enjoyable to spend a long time to prepare for an event, it is a myth that high society ladies took hours to get dressed or even needed help getting dressed. Next slide, please, Val. I want to share a great video with you guys by a costumer named, she's a historical costumer named Isabel Pritcher. And she shows us how quickly she can put on a full 1860s day dress on her own. And this is all the stuff from start to finish, sped up with a stopwatch going. And she even puts on those button boots by herself, and you know the ones with the small buttons going up each side. And here's a YouTube video link in chat. Now, I hope you guys don't have any questions for me, because it sounds like I really know a lot about Victorian fashion, but I really don't, except to say that yes, I do actually own a real and proper corset, and yes, I do know how to lace it up right and by myself. That's it for me. Thanks.
Thank you. That was so fun, Bethany. And you can bookmark that YouTube video to watch later. And I think you can get the idea of how much fun it is when you find a research topic to just dig into it and find out these facts. I learned a lot from that about Victorian era ladies' clothes. You'll notice in this slide, I just took a quick slide of the carriage ride you can take at the Dickens Project to point out that you can go alone, go all over the place, or you can go with a group or on a tour. And all of these projects that you're hearing about today are archived. We place them every year in the buildings provided by Caledonia. and the Dickens Project team. So you can imagine how much fun it is for students to be able to engage in this. I do want, and it's kind of like bringing history to life, or also entering a story rather than simply reading it. CVL has a sister library located in Amsterdam, and it's called the Antique Pattern Library. And this is a place that provides resources online from historical manuscripts, images, and patterns, like embroidery patterns for the fabrics and tapestries. Here's a sample from their library's website. You can also bookmark this to look at later. This particular link was provided for the Dickens Project for researchers to use. We also have the Antique Pattern Library at our VWEC Kitely Hub in the virtual world of Kitely. And there are examples from a variety of historical eras. Our next panelist is the leader of the VWEC Info Center in Kitely. And Kreatya Shannon is just now graduating with her MLS. Kreatya Shannon was a student researcher for the Dickens Project. She's going to tell us about bringing Victorian literature into 3D. Kreatya?
Thank you, Val. And after this, I will let you know when to advance the slides, please. Thank you. As was said, my name is Shannon Broden, known in virtual environments either as Kreatya or Kreatya Shannon. Today, I will talk about learning in period virtual environments and ways that students can dip their toes into beginning to do these kinds of research presentations. And also, again, as was mentioned, recently I completed requirements for my Master's in Library and Information Science degree at San Jose State University. There I focused on user experience and emerging tech. I joined San Jose State University's Vicara early in my program as well. And that gave me the opportunity to initially explore virtual worlds, doing independent exploration versus in the classroom environment. Val, can you go to the next slide for me? Now, it turns out that when I came to SJSU, some of my undergrad work had actually been in English literature. And one of the first places I got to see was the Victorian village that we have there at the iSchool. So working with that pre-existing Victorian village setup, I was able to create a house that celebrated the history and works of Dickens' contemporaries, Robert and Elizabeth Barrett Browning. It allowed me to work with material that I already knew from my undergrad research, and at the same time, I was learning Second Life basics in a way that I could present this material to others. I had never built in Second Life before at that particular point that I was in school. And additionally, the Browning House, as it's come to be nicknamed, made me aware of how accessibility impacts experiences in virtual worlds, something I would go build on in later builds that I've done. An example is that there's a phonograph in the second floor. Val, can you go to the next slide? And the phonograph that's rather on the first floor will play my reading a couple lines of a piece of poetry from Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And that was the first time I ever had embedded voice into any object in Second Life. So not only was I learning how to do some of the basics, I was being able to engage in different ways and bring myself into it. So to me, this could be an effective way to introduce students to the basic mechanics, and like I said, based on my own personal experience. With focus on the research of the subject and learning those fundamentals, while the more complicated parts already being provided for me, like the furniture, the home, I didn't have to think about those aspects. It could help ensure that students focus on getting the basics done first while they're learning the period and historical material. Val, if you could do the next slide, please. Now, you might have some students that find that level of building is too difficult a leap to begin with. There's also the approach of integrating a more traditional slide deck presentation within an immersive building experience. The other early piece that I did in the Victorian village is a slide presentation in the post office, which is just down the street a little from the Browning house. And in this case, I placed it up on the upper floor. So you don't necessarily see it if the avatar is walking by, but you can go in, feel the immersion of the first floor of the post office. If you wander upstairs, there's the presentation next to the telegraph machines, still keeping all the feel. And this really is something that allows to meet students at their skill level. Next slide, Val, please. I think we went backwards.
I'm not sure I have another one beyond this one. Let me just double check.
Okay, you might not.
Okay.
So my personal creations are in the era where Dickens lived, took their basis in literature and history. I believe this kind of student experience could help encourage students in an engaging way on any period-related topic. Thank you for the opportunity to present today. And Marie mentioned that there is a building that has her presentation on the first floor. If you go up onto the second floor, you will find additional presentations that talk about the process that I went through with both of these builds, and they can also still actively be visited at the Victorian Village. Thank you again.
Thank you, Kreatya Shannon. Yes, if you go to the CVL Research Warehouse, you just wander outside down to the left, you'll find the Crystal Palace House, you'll find Kreatya's build upstairs. As I said, we strive to archive all of these research projects and continue to share them year after year and have them expand. And I really love hearing the student perspective, and because that student's perspective is why we're even here at the Virtual Worlds Education Consortium, to find the best practices for teaching and learning in the metaverse. And we try to add new research every year. The next presenter is going to share our latest research. One of our panelists was unable to present today, P. Ilios. Now, P has researched healthcare and medicine in the Victorian times. She shares her research project in both English and Spanish. And we often display that and bring in people who are interested in hearing it in Spanish. But the brand new research project this year, which shows that immersive environments are dynamic, every year, as I said, our visits can be new, they can be unique and different. We've added Esperanza Fries's art research. So over to you, SB.
Thanks, Val, and thanks for including me in this exciting presentation. And I'm learning so much. It's really great. But today I'm going to talk to you, first of all, hi, everyone. I'm going to talk to you about Victorian art. As a professional researcher, I'm asked to create background information on all types of information subjects, from scientific discoveries to marine mammals, to artificial intelligence and robotics. Today, my research features art of the Victorian era. And you might think that this has nothing to do with science, but it actually does. Queen Victoria of Great Britain, for whom the Victorian era was named, spanned 63 years of Queen Victoria's reign over Great Britain and Ireland, from 1837 to her death in 1901. New scientific discoveries were during this age, allowed the Victorians to become increasingly revolutionary in their use of color. New hues were greeted with both excitement and suspicion. The explosion of color was embraced by artists, designers, and many others in all walks of 19th century life. Victorian art reflected most of the Christian and royal ideals of the time, with a variety of themes such as landscapes and all types of portrait art. Fairy motifs were popular too, and female characters were always a part of Victorian art. There was also a standard scenery theme, and usually of painted farmlands or hilly landscapes. Victorians loved dramatic contrast too. This can be seen in both single and group portraits. The paintings with people could often be reflected by the colors they wore. As poverty, hunger, and disease all became increasingly urgent issues in industrial Britain, many artists began to consider how their work could benefit society, believing that art could change minds and spur action. They produced paintings, prints, and decorative objects that were designed to not merely comment on social problems, but actively participate in solving them. Victorian artists played an important role in societal changes. Many artists believed that art's purpose was to contribute to the general good and to improve life. They responded to the social concerns of their day by using their positions as public figures to write articles in political journals, to donate their artworks to charity and auctions, to design banners, for posters for social movements, or paint scenes that address the country's most pressing problems. Victorian artists were at the front line of reform efforts, using their art to develop strategies to confront the most urgent social problems of the day. One of the more famous artists during the Victorian era was, slide please, 1st Baron Leighton, known as Sir Frederick Leighton. He painted between 1878 and 1896. He was a painter, a draftsman, and a sculptor. His works depicted historical, biblical, and classical subject matter in an academic style that was developed by the European art academies of the time. Flaming June, the painting on the right, or on my right, your left, is a painting by Leighton. It was produced in 1895, and it's painted with oils on canvas. It depicts a sleeping woman in a sensuous version of his classic academic style. It's Leighton's most recognizable work and is much reproduced in posters and other media. Flaming June disappeared from view in the 1930s and was rediscovered in the 1960s. It was auctioned shortly after that, or during a period of time known to be difficult for selling Victorian-era paintings. Where it failed to sell for its low reserve price of $140 US, after the auction, it was promptly purchased by the Museum of Puerto Rico. It is currently on loan to the Royal Academy of Arts in London. The Victorian age ended in 1901, by which time many of the most prominent Victorian artists had already died. In the early 20th century, the Victorian attitudes and arts became extremely unpopular. So that was the end of the Victorian art era. In America, the Gilded Age ran about the same time, and it kind of mirrored what was going on during the Victoria era. And the clothing, some of the clothing were the same, and their artists mimic some of the styles. So that's another research topic. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for sharing this as our latest research project. And I want to mention that Dickens, in addition to his writings, provides a glimpse into the difficult times that he lived in. And here's an example on this slide of many of the other research projects that we've curated that over the years that are on display in the CVL warehouse and in that neighborhood of the Dickens Project. He was a law clerk, and he included much about the law and the legal system of the time in his stories. We've had projects on research on marriage and home life. his marriage was very unhappy. We have research on the food of the Victorian era, the working conditions, and much more. Our final panelist today is Gentle Heron, the leader at Virtual Disability Island. And Gentle is going to share about disabilities in Dickens literature. Gentle?
Thank you, Val. And hello to all the Dickens fans who are here today. SB mentioned some features of Victorian art that can also be seen in Dickens literature. His stories do include a lot of female characters. His stories often portrayed very dramatic contrasts, and his writing certainly reflect the social, political, and economic characteristics of the Victorian age. Dickens included many characters with a wide range of disabilities in his fiction. Sometimes he portrayed these characters very realistically, but at other times he made them into caricatures. Overall, Victorians were uncomfortable with both the idea and the reality of disability, and their mixed feelings about disability showed in their ambivalence. Victorians generally feared disability and people who were disabled. Persons whose conditions left them with disfigurement were often seen as monsters. Dickens portrayed these individuals as morally depraved villains. And an example of that is the schoolmaster quilt in the old curiosity shop. And I love these old pictures of some of these Dickens characters. The physical deformity of these corrupt victimizers were shown to be the outward appearance of their inner depravity. The Victorians also pitied people who were lesser due to their disability. And Tiny Tim in The Christmas Carol is an example of that. He's stereotypically pure, spiritual. They'd consider him a helpless innocent. And characters like this were seen as inspirational, but also they were passively objectified. A late developing disability was sometimes viewed in Victorian times as actually a divine retribution for sin. So we've got Mrs. Skewton in Dombey and Son. She uses her bath chair to create an illusion of social status and wealth. And she unfortunately constantly mistreats the poor man who has to push her chair. Dickens shows her with a massive makeup, lots of fancy clothing. She's a figure of falseness. Mrs. Skewton's pretense of disability and her mistreatment of her chairman lead to her terminal illness. And that's when she becomes truly dependent on the chair and on the assistance of other people. Her wheeled chair then is a metaphor for her character's imprisonment. And this would have been viewed by Victorians as a form of retributive justice. Although most people with disabilities were charitably viewed as being deserving poor, everybody was poor, they were disabled. They were deserving poor because they were unable to be employed. But some people with disabilities were portrayed as shirkers or hustlers. And you can see the contrast between Jenny Wren and Silas Wegg in Our Mutual Friend. Jenny was considered deserving poor because she contributed to society by making doll clothes. Silas, on the other hand, was portrayed very negatively. He had a wooden peg leg, but he was also depicted as wooden in overall appearance and action. He was portrayed as deformed in his character as well as in his body. Smike in Nicholas Nickleby is a severely disabled boy. He's often described as feeble-minded and frail, but his disabilities may have come from abuse rather than being genetically or disease-free. Dickens' intention in creating so many characters with disabilities in his story was to promote social reform and charity toward the poor and those with disabilities. Now, I'm a reader, but I'm not a historian, and I'm not a literature expert. So I hope that this study has illustrated one way that immersive historical research can include everyone, not just experts. Maybe this information will help you become more aware of all the disabled characters in Dickens' various stories. It may encourage you to think about whether portraying existing cultural attitudes in literature can actually promote social reform. And perhaps there's a deeper question I could ask. Have society's attitude about people with disabilities changed since Victorian time? So I want to thank you all for being with us for this panel today. It wasn't quite as long as the Victorian era. And back to you, Val.
Thank you, Gentle, so much. And thank you, all of my panelists here today. We're sure that you can see that the research possibilities are endless and they can be fun. And you're probably thinking, I might want to research something about the Victorian era. Contact me later because there's always next year. We can add more. In fact, you all know Sheila Weber in the UK. Her husband contributed music, Victorian era music, and I'll put it in local chat on Thursday, December 19th during the noon Virtual Worlds Education Roundtable. We're going to glimpse into Victorian music. So there's room for you to add research. It's fun for everyone to continue. Now, before we have some questions, I want to just give you a little bit of housekeeping, and then we will open up for some questions. I want to thank everyone for attending today, and just a reminder, you will be able to find the recording of today's presentation on our VWEC YouTube channel. It's there in the local chat. Please know we welcome new volunteers. We want to network with you and your communities. Anyone interested in teaching and learning in virtual worlds. We also welcome volunteers to work at our info center. You can contact me or Sue Moon Magic. Our next expert series will be on January the 10th with Roxy Nero and BJ Gearbox sharing VEG, the Virtual Education Journal, which is now starting up again after a hiatus. To see all the VWEC events, please check out the VWEC Plaza events calendar there in the local chat. And finally, please join us for our Friday happy hour. We're going to open up there for Q&A. Let me just pull my slide up for that. And I also have a surprise to pull out on the deck. So let's all stand up and let's walk over to the deck. I'll share some additional social media links and we'll have a fun time of conversation with our panelists for those of you that can stay for a bit. So follow me. The deck is right over here. We have some refreshments for everyone. I'll stand right here to res my little surprise. I'm going to put a few of our social media links here in the chat. We're on many social media channels, Discord, etc. There are many ways to share this research. We have PowerPoint presentations, buildings, and I want to pull out what ESPY's added this year. It's a research kiosk. So I'm going to pull that out right here so you can take a peek. And inside the kiosk, oh, that's not it. Hold on. See if I can find her kiosk. All of her kiosk has research links right in it that you can interact with. So panelists, let's just have an open conversation. Feel free to use local chat or speak up in voice and ask a question to any of our panelists.